Дорогі українці, європейська країна починається з кожного. Так, ми обрали шлях до Європи. Але Європа не десь там. Європа, вона ось тут.
The economy is improving. Long-stalled land reforms are on the way. A historic prisoner swap with Russia was just completed. And the novice president is proving himself surprisingly tough and adept in dealing with the revanchist Kremlin regime to the north. Just over 100 days into Volodymyr Zelensky's term, that strange sound you hear is the sound of optimism in Ukraine. Is it warranted, or is it yet another false dawn? Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is veteran Kremlin watcher and former U.S. State Department official Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, gentlemen. Nice to be back.
Welcome back, Don. Welcome back to America.
You too.
We've both been in the air a lot the last couple of weeks. And also joining us in the studio is my old friend Volodymyr Dubovyk, an associate professor in the Faculty of International Relations at Mechnikov National University in Odessa and director of its Center for International Studies. Welcome back to the podcast, Volodya, and welcome to Washington.
Right. Thank you for having me, Brian.
Good to have you. And we're going to start with you because you're, unlike Don and I, you've actually been in Ukraine.
Right.
I was last there in April in between rounds. I've not been in Zelensky's Ukraine yet. I saw a very nervous Ukraine, nervous Kyiv when I was in Kyiv in April between the rounds. Although the writing was on the wall, it was pretty clear Zelenskyy was going to win the runoff. We've been hearing a lot of positive reviews of Zelensky's first 100 days, and I know you're not so optimistic about this, and I trust your judgment on this. We just passed the milestone a couple of weeks ago of 100 days on August 27th. It's an arbitrary milestone, but yet it's one we use.
FDR-esque.
So how is this just optics? Are the optics just good? Is Zelenskyy moving Ukraine in the right direction? How do you see his presidency 100 days in?
Well, I still think that's early to judge, and I still think that he has a chance of moving Ukraine in the right direction. Is he moving Ukraine already in the right direction? That's an open question to me, and I'm not convinced on that. It all depends on not where you are, whether you are in Ukraine or outside Ukraine. We also in Ukraine have lots of perspectives on that.
Right.
Obviously, if you look at the successes at the elections of Zelenskyy and his party, and most Ukrainians are optimistic, and there is this feeling in the air that we're moving in the right direction. But even among the things that you mentioned, the economy is doing well. But it's doing all right, but it wasn't doing that bad prior to him coming to power.
Yeah.
So that's not like here in this country as well. Like where do you put this border or some kind of some kind of mark? Economy is doing well because of what? Maybe because of things happening.
Who do you give credit to?
Yeah, maybe things happened several years ago, and that's why it's doing well right now. So, and then of course in terms of swap of prisoners, that's a good thing. I'm happy for these people to be back, but there was similar exchanges of prisoners before, actually in bigger numbers.
But this is a high profile one with
not with
with
with that kind of names on the list. But again, I also join those who say, well, we shouldn't be cynical enough to say, oh, that exchange wasn't good enough because we only got some Ukrainian soldiers, and now we've got Sentsov and some others back. But under Poroshenko, there have been several exchanges with a much larger number of Ukrainians coming back. So we shouldn't forget about that too. And then also we don't know exactly in Ukraine what kind of conditions were attached to this exchange. Was there something discussed behind the scenes? Is there something else that Kremlin expects from Zelenskyy to deliver? I don't know. You said he's adept in dealing with Kremlin. He's probably a different type of challenge for Kremlin because he's a different type of politician, in the post-Soviet space.
Yeah, no, my sense is, and we're going to get into that in very good detail in the second half, but the Kremlin doesn't know how to deal with him. I get that sense, but
I think they're figuring it out slowly. I mean, Putin is a very, experienced apparatchik. He'll find out, how to deal with Zelenskyy.
In terms of what he's done, the optics have been awesome. The optics have been great, right? But I was searching yesterday for things that have actually been done, policies that have been enacted. Go ahead. I want to get both you and Don on that.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, I don't see what has changed except for his persona. He has a certain type of charisma and personality and ongoing personality, open and, new generation kind of guy. So that's only thing that I see, which is a big, major change from previous president.
Don, what do you think? Is this just a fix, or do we?
You don't want to
should we
get
really...
too much consensus on one program. I largely agree with our friend here. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Right.
I think over the long term, as I've said many times here, and very long term, Ukraine is going in the right direction. But it's too early to tell. And the questions you're going to get into shortly, I think, are important to dive into in more detail.
Well, let's
Domestically, I think it's too early to tell, although there's been some positive things. Foreign policy, I guess I would say, greater concerns.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let's take the domestic issues one at a time. Let's start. I mean, the issue you have to talk about if you're talking about Ukraine, and that's corruption. Right. This is where Poroshenko is a big disappointment. I've often said that this is the most important phase of Ukraine's transition. I saw, again, the Orange Revolution. I saw from independence on, you had political freedom and you had competitive elections, starting with 94. That was Ukraine's first revolution, right? The second revolution was the Orange Revolution, which basically established the principle of oligarchic pluralism. Not one oligarch is going to dominate Ukraine. There's going to be multiple oligarchs. That oligarchic pluralism would translate into political pluralism. And the Maidan was all about taking that very difficult step from oligarchic pluralism to real pluralism. I thought at the time, when I was optimistic about Poroshenko, that who more than a babygarch, a little oligarch, to do that? Somebody from the inside to move Ukraine. He would prove to be a big disappointment on that front. There were hopes about Zelenskyy on one hand, and there were concerns about Zelenskyy because of his obvious ties with Ihor Kolomoisky. Volodya, how do you see this?
Well, on corruption, first of all, with Poroshenko and his history in office, which you referred to, I agree. I tend to agree with you. I think some things were achieved, some reforms, then they stalled. Corruption persisted. System wasn't broken. He wasn't the right person, probably, to start with, to deal with this. He was a part of the same old post-Soviet Ukrainian political elite. He was around for a long time, so probably it was on our part, whoever was optimistic back then after Euromaidan, unrealistic to expect him to deliver and set the bar way too high, yes. And he didn't. So that's a problem, and Ukrainians are aware of that because we deal with it every day. That's the reality of our life. It's not just in higher echelons; it's in daily lives.
Has Zelenskyy moved the ball at all? I mean, we now the anti-corruption court is working, which is more than you could say under Poroshenko.
Again, like Don just said, it's on the rhetorical level so far. It's on the promises level, and all the praise that I'm seeing so far in the press and among the scholars on Zelenskyy is in reaction to what he's still promising to deliver.
Right.
When I actually see the fruits, there, then I'll be able to say he's succeeding or not. But right now he's just saying, we got to do that, we got to do that, and people say, yeah, sure, exactly. But we knew it all along which direction we need to move to.
Right.
The problem is that we haven't quite moved in that direction.
Right. And now, I mean, just this morning, I got an email from my friends at the Kyiv Post asking for comments on apparently yesterday. No, I was not watching the news yesterday because I was in transit from Tbilisi to Munich to here, so I had not much time to watch the Ukrainian news. But apparently there was a raid on Privat Bank, which was the former bank of Kolomoisky. This happened apparently after a meeting between the president and Kolomoisky. And as we know, that was Kolomoisky's bank. It was taken away from him by Poroshenko. Are we seeing, again, is this the same? There's concerns that this is the same old, right? So now, if you kind of go by that template, Kolomoisky's guy's back in power, and now he's going to use law enforcement to put that bank back in Kolomoisky's hand. Do you suspect that might be what's happening right now? Well, we don't know yet.
Yeah, Privat Bank is a major test of what we're going to make out of Zelenskyy. And of course, Kolomoisky's closeness, or rather Zelensky's closeness to Kolomoisky has been a big issue for a lot of us in Ukraine, minority apparently, as it turned out, who were suspicious about this connection. That was a big deal. To most Ukrainians, however, apparently it wasn't a big deal. So they said, okay, fine, he's close to Kolomoisky, so what? And besides, of course, Kolomoisky's controversial figure in many ways. He's a complex figure too. Early on, after 2014, he was very helpful to Poroshenko and Ukraine, being governor of the Dnipropetrovsk region and putting up these battalions to fight in Donbass and so on, and actually contributing to preventing from spread of Russian aggression from Donbass to other adjacent areas.
You can accuse Kolomoisky of a lot of things, but being pro-Russian ain't one of them.
Yeah, but then they had a quarrel with Poroshenko, and we know what happened then. But with Privatbank, when it was nationalized by Ukrainian government, you said like Poroshenko took it over. It was by Ukrainian government, and Americans applauded that. I mean, and still are.
Right.
Most people you ask in this town, they say Privatbank should stay, in the hands of the government.
Knowing how Ukraine operates, knowing that this happened after his feud with Kolomoisky,
that's true. But also he abused the bank. He looted his own bank. The bank was in a terrible situation, and that's a very important bank for Ukraine.
Right.
A lot of people in Ukraine have their savings in that bank. If it goes down, that's a major blow against the Ukrainian economy. So that Ukrainian government stepped in at that point of time and took it over, nationalized, and saved it, stabilized it.
Now, is there a reason for the Ukrainian government to step in now?
I don't think so, but there might be some legal leads to that, but otherwise, the bank is actually doing fine.
Don, what are your thoughts on that?
I largely agree. I want to be fair to Zelenskyy. I think the 100 days, which is to some extent, as you said, artificial.
Very arbitrary. It's three
but
months.
But it's important that when you have public opinion largely favorable, when you have an electoral mandate, it's important that you move quickly. And he's got a new government. Pristaiko, I know. New faces. They're very impressive. They took away the judicial immunity, the immunity from prosecution of the MPs. Good stuff.
Yeah.
What I do not see and have not seen in the whole campaign is a strategy for demonopolization. Corruption, fighting corruption, and getting these people their hands out of the trough. And I agree with what you said. It's just what is going on, and you can get some political capital from a high-profile PR move.
Right.
But the bottom line is you've got to attack this, and I'm seeing no.
And remember, a lot of his first 100 days were consumed with the parliamentary elections.
Yeah,
absolutely,
so
absolutely.
That's the other thing to bear in
now
mind.
it's time. Now it's time.
So I mean, we might want to start measuring the 100 days from the parliamentary elections rather than from the presidential. Volodya, I know you wanted to jump in here.
Quickly, two things. One is basically in continuation of what you just said, Brian. Indeed, it's 100 days, not from the time when he was elected, or not even from the time when he was inaugurated, not even from the parliamentary elections, but I think from the time when the government was formed, because actually a lot of people think that the president of Ukraine decides everything, but he doesn't. It's a powerful figure in Ukraine, of course, but a lot of things are up to the government. So when the government formed, that's when we actually have to start the countdown. Right. And second thing on immunity, here I probably will have to disagree slightly with Don, because I don't necessarily see it just as a positive thing. There have been debates about immunity being lifted for the members of parliament for a long time, but then people also said, a lot of experts, you need it in Ukraine. I mean, if you have a strong executive, you need then a strong, legislative also. Yeah. So now, if you assume that someone wants to go up after some opposition people, they can, right? And that's in Ukraine when you don't have a viable institutions, when you don't have a rule of law. It's a risk. It's a risk.
Well, no, great minds think alike. Apparently, I was asked about this by Ukrainian journalists, and I said, in principle, I like the idea of stripping parliamentary immunity, but only in the context of a truly independent judiciary that cannot be used as an agent of the executive branch. There's another thing floating out there. Valeria Gontareva, the former head of the central bank, is now being attacked by Zelenskyy. Is this a cause for concern, or?
I don't know. She's been even physically attacked, but we don't know by whom actually. And outside of Ukraine, in London, I think. So politically, yes. Zelenskyy will definitely use this, I would say, theme of the previous government failing dramatically. Right. They all do that, all right? So for some, the less of an achievement...
in every country.
Yeah. The less of actual achievement by Zelenskyy, the more will be this talk that we hear that the previous guy screwed it up, so we're only trying to fix it, give us more time, and so on. But the question then becomes also how long Ukrainians will be willing to be patient. Are they going to, to listen to Zelenskyy promising things and not delivering for a long time? And how long? What is long? Because a lot of people expect tons of things from Zelenskyy. Each Ukrainian who voted for him would expect something, his own set, her own set of expectations, and he's going gonna inevitably fail a lot of those
Well,
expectations.
let's before we move into the second half, I did want to kind of go through some of the challenges that he faces and some of the things he has to do. I mean, as I talk to people, they say the reform of the SBU is crucial. Judicial reform to finally create this independent judiciary in Ukraine and create the institutional framework to assure judicial independence in Ukraine. Land reform, now he's promised land reform is on the table, and the privatizations of major state companies. Did I miss anything here?
Well, I think there's the general issue of the decentralization of power and
Yeah.
all that stuff, which
And
is
that's an ongoing process that's going on right now.
which is going to be extremely difficult. Can I just add a footnote to what Volodymyr said? I've heard several Ukrainian observers who are Ukrainian comment about the danger of what would be the equivalent of one-party rule.
Yes.
And I don't think that's going to be as much of a problem in Ukraine because there's such a vibrant civil society and a lot of people speaking their mind. It's a check on this happening. But it is something to watch. I just read an article this morning about it. It's something to watch, but I don't think right now it's a danger.
No, I was just at the McCain Institute's Tbilisi International Conference in Tbilisi, and there were Ukrainian civil society activists there, not surprising, and they were all very optimistic about working with and how he was dealing with the civil society. Do you think is that warranted, Volodymyr, in your opinion?
Well, let's put it this way. We are willing to work with him when he's doing the right thing. I mean, all of us Ukrainians, regardless of how we voted and who we supported in elections. Mm-hmm. So, and NGOs the same way, the civil society, the think tanks, they're willing to, to offer the helping hand to him. But first, he needs to show that he's trying to move in the right direction. When you mentioned the government is there, government is great. I mean, if you look at the names,
personnel-wise, I couldn't be more pleased with the government.
It's unique. I mean, it's unprecedented that you have these people in place, including those who are responsible for. You mentioned Pristaiko, Don, including those who are responsible for foreign policy, defense, and security. On fixing judiciary, long overdue. I mean, we're basically lacking third branch of power. I mean, so that's a major.
It's an extension of the executive.
That's a major problem with SBU and other law enforcement. That's another problem. In the current shape, they can be easily used against opposition, and they've been turned under previous various administrations of Ukraine into, the attack dogs for whoever is in government right now. So that's a problem. It's a huge problem, of course. The police reform as well. I mean, I regret that Avakov, like many of us, stayed in his position because he didn't do much. I was going to bring up Avakov. He didn't do much to reform police at all, or prevented it from being reformed.
What do you make of that? Because we were talking about this a bit in Tbilisi, about what Avakov is a red flag, and why did Zelenskyy need to keep Avakov? Now, some people are thinking, well, Avakov did assure that the elections were free and fair and that there was no shenanigans during, which allowed Zelenskyy to win. And maybe this is payback.
I think that was a major thing.
That's the thinking. But I was
a payback. But he's also very experienced apparatchik there. He knows how to, ins and outs and how to work the system, and he might be needed. And that's again when you see the immunity of members of parliament lifted, and then you see people like Avakov, kept in his position. That in combination creates an impression of even bigger risk of actually them going after some opposition.
You constantly ask yourself, is there a need for any politician to pay off political debts or something? And so you try to be understanding of the position, but it's worth flagging, as gentlemen both did. It's worth flagging.
There is a widespread theory that Avakov has like dossiers and files on everyone. He probably does, but I don't think that's the most decisive factor.
Right. I would be extremely surprised and shocked if he didn't.
I think everyone has on everyone else. So,
but do they? I mean, how heavy a political lift is judicial reform and his reform of the SBU? I mean, can they? Now, he's got a huge majority in parliament, so it shouldn't be that heavy a lift, but you're going to have some institutional pushback. What do you think? And Don, what do you think on this? I mean, can they pull this?
I think it's really difficult because we're talking about not just people, you're talking about a mindset.
You're talking about systema.
Yeah, you're talking about systema. You're talking about law and power and corruption, and this is a systemic problem. It's not something you whack down in a week or two. So you got to do step by step. They're going to be steps backward, but it's going to be very difficult, and you need pressure from the civil society on it. You need pressure from the parliament on it. We've yet to see that. I hope it comes about, but this is a systemic problem. It's not just a matter of personnel.
It would require a huge participation from average Ukrainians, common rank and file people, because they're part of this corrupt system.
Yeah.
When I go in somewhere and paying a bribe, in daily lives, they should stop doing that.
Right.
And that requires a lot of change, major change in their
You
thinking.
make an excellent point.
Yes.
This goes down to everyday
Right.
life. Police on the
Everyone is
streets.
complicit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, the other thing in this, not unrelated, is we got land reform and major privatizations.
Right,
coming
that's
up.
another point.
And this, again, I mean, the sad story of post-Soviet privatizations. We all know the Russian history and, and how that created the oligarchs to begin with. Similar kind of process in Ukraine.
Right.
Have we learned the lessons of the past? Can you do land reform in Ukraine without it being massively corrupt?
Probably did. I think it will be somewhat corrupt anyway. But I applaud that decision. One decision on allowing sales of land. That's the one I applaud, and I have a strong position on that. I think if you're building market economy, it's unthinkable that for so many years Ukraine didn't have for people opportunity to buy land and own the land. That's unbelievable, and that was prevented for a long time when communists were around, socialism when we were strong in the 90s.
Right.
But they're out of it for a long time now.
Yeah.
So why is it why is it
There's no
delay?
excuse now.
Of course there are risks there too. I mean, but you can limit. For instance, people say, Chinese or others will come in and buy all the land, but you can limit it somehow, or even. But I say the alternative, that the land is wasted. It lays wasted and not being worked on. And agriculture,
Especially in Ukraine, when
yeah,
such rich
exactly.
world.
Exactly. The farmers cannot really own land. That's unbelievable and inexcusable, really. So if they move in that direction, whatever shape this land reform will take, that would be already progress.
Right.
Would be some abuses, like I said, would be some case of corruption. There would be some, of course, but it's a move in the right direction, absolutely.
Okay, Don, anything to add before we
No,
move on
I
to the
agree, and
second
I'm
half?
glad you mentioned the Chinese, which I was going to, but it gives you a segue into foreign
And
policy.
not just the Chinese, but the Russians as well.
the Russians.
I mean, they might open the door for the Russians to.
Even now, they own a lot of things in Ukraine, actually, through intermediaries maybe, but they do own a lot. Yeah.
Here's a great way to segue, because we're going to talk about the Russians. Now, in a few moments, we'll continue our discussion and shift to foreign affairs and Zelensky's handling of Vladimir Putin. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is veteran Kremlin watcher and former U.S. State Department official Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us in the studio is my old friend Volodymyr Dubovyk, an associate professor in the Faculty of International Relations at Mechnikov National University in Odessa, where I used to lecture as well, by the way, when we met back in the 90s, and the director of its Center for International Studies. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So he famously trolled Putin over passports. He's been willing to play hardball in the Black Sea, and he's just secured the release of Ukrainian sailors and other prisoners, including the acclaimed filmmaker Oleg Sentsov, who we are all happy to see out. All of them. We've been following the Sentsov case for a long time. He's inspired Kremlin opponents to the extent that one Russian emigre recently remarked that, and I'm quoting, the leader of the Russian opposition is now the president of Ukraine. That is Konstantin von Eggers, who actually said that in a conference in Vilnius, and I think it's pretty much on the, it's pretty interesting comment. But this is true. The Russian opposition is looking at Zelenskyy. Yeah, he's kind of a model there,
Right.
And that's also an interesting piece of this whole puzzle. Volodya, how would you assess his handling of Putin? We got into this a little bit in the first half. Let's do a deep dive into it now. Is he really getting the best of him, or is this a dangerous illusion?
That's a good question. I think the truth is somewhere in between those two options that you suggest. Well, first of all, indeed, if he delivers major change in Ukraine, then he would actually become a threat for Putin and Putinism. And has been posed to be like this for years and years now. Right. If Ukraine succeeds, that's one of the major reasons why Putin is undermining Ukraine for years. If Ukraine succeeds, that's a powerful message to Russians.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, and it stays rhetorics and only promises and no big, deep reforms, then Putin's fine, and he's betting on that kind of scenario to be taken.
I mean, their first interaction, I think, is actually very telling. And it's been analyzed to death, but let's just talk about this a little bit. I mean, the passports. I mean, this was it's classic Putin trolling, right? Zelensky wins the election. Putin comes in and says, I'm going to offer passports to all Ukrainians, and which is a classic little kind of mafia move, kind of this kind of around the clock. I mean, Khodorkovsky was talking about this when he was here in Washington, saying this is a classic move by kind of a mafia leader to kind of intimidate your opponent this way. Zelensky came right back at him with a similar kind of mafia move, saying, well, why would anybody want a Russian passport? What do you a passport to be oppressed? I'm willing to offer a Ukrainian passport to Russians.
I like the sounds of it.
And I'm wondering if that was Kolomoisky talking and not Zelensky. I'm not sure, but that did kind of put Putin back on his heels. Zelensky showed that he can give as good as he can get, at least in these kind of rhetorical optic games. And the seizure of the Russian vessel that involved in blocking the Kerch Strait was also, a thing that he's not afraid to play hardball. I've been following how the Russian press has been treating Zelensky. A day doesn't go by when Izvestia doesn't have a article attacking Zelensky about how he's incompetent and stupid and foolish and creating chaos in Ukraine and presiding over a failed state and yada, yada, yada. And I began to interpret this as like they do see the danger of a Russian speaker from central to eastern Ukraine, depending on where you geographically put him. Somebody they would think would be theirs, and they're surprised, не наши, что это такое, How do you take this?
Well, it's probably true. A lot of people expected him to be changing policy quickly in a way of giving up too much of Ukrainian interests and conceding to Putin, actually, and being pro-Russian. And let's face it, a lot of pro-Russian people voted for Zelensky as well. And he, Odessa, especially in the south and Odessa region in the city, they've been emboldened. A lot of pro-Russian activists who were, kind of silent for years. Then now with Zelensky victory, they're feeling encouraged and emboldened. But so far, he didn't really deliver much to Putin. But I'm not either.
I don't think he delivered anything.
I'm not thinking that he's winning too much. It's either one of those two discourses and narratives that I see these days. It's either that he is failing dramatically in betraying Ukraine and conceding too much on the one extreme, and another extreme he is tired of winning. But I don't see either of those as being, matching what's happening in reality. I don't know what Don sees.
Don, what do you
I have a lot to say foreign policy.
All right.
Some of it negative, but I think first of all, the fact of the election, both parliamentary and presidential, that has had a blowback on Russia already, and it may have contributed to the size of the demonstrations over the summer. If Putin, as he says, Russia, Ukraina, nasha, then it shows that some Eastern Slavs can behave like a normal democratic society, at least in terms of going to the polls and freely electing a government. Number one, I do not think he's been handling Putin particularly well, but negative. I think he's doing his best. I think these sort of passive-aggressive pushbacks are good optics, but
the seizure of the Russian vessel was...
Well, that's to some extent passive-aggressive. I think that my concern during the campaign was we didn't know where he'd be on foreign policy.
Yeah.
I think he steered the country to Brussels and the West in a way that I find admirable.
And he's
but there are
backed
a lot
off of the silly things, like when he a referendum on NATO membership and all of this stuff.
He said some really silly things. I was going to say stupid, but silly is more diplomatic.
You're a former diplomat. So
yes, and he's backed off from that, I think, and his behavior is very... he's doing the right things. It's the specific issues that I have more trouble with. Number one, this issue of the Normandy talks.
Right.
Number two, the Minsk process, both of which I think are losers and which Putin is undoubtedly trying to manipulate. Number three is a very, very, let me say it again, very, very problematic relationship with Trump, where no one what's going on, and every day there's a new story about when they will meet or they won't meet. And finally, the prisoner exchange. I do not understand why the MH17
that was the one negative aspect of that.
Guy was included in the trade.
Yeah.
I think he would have been much better out. Now, if Putin said either he's included or
That's
in
probably
the
that's
trade,
what I strongly suspect.
fine, then I might, but I understand it's a tough call. I'm just troubled by the fact that he was given up.
No, Don, you raised
Too many issues at once. Apologize.
Right.
No, not fair. I mean, you raised Minsk and Normandy, and and now again, as I was talking to Ukrainian activists in Tbilisi about this, this is one of the things, one of the concerns I was hearing is that Zelenskyy wants peace in the East, but peace at what cost?
Right.
And they're afraid he might not have the chops to basically get it. The one area where I give Poroshenko an A+.
War leader. Yeah.
Is not just a war leader. He was dealt a horrible, horrible, horrible hand.
Absolutely, yeah.
When the Minsk agreements were signed, I was like, this is the end of Ukraine. This is the end of Ukraine's sovereignty. This is a bad deal. This is the Dayton Accords applied to Ukraine.
It will still be.
Donbass is going to turn into Republika Srpska.
We haven't seen the end of it.
Be decentralized. But I thought Poroshenko played that hand absolutely masterfully. Right. Absolutely masterfully, frustrating the Russians at every turn. Because the Russians, in terms of the sequencing, first you decentralize, and then we have, he's like, no, first you give me back the border. Then we talk about everything else. And he stuck to that line. And as a result, I think Ukraine is still whole. As a result, more as whole as you can be when your territory is being occupied. It didn't turn into this decentralized, dysfunctional Bosnia-Herzegovina type post-Dayton scenario where you had this little statelet, which was effectively controlled from the outside. And the jury is still out on whether Zelenskyy has the chops to handle this as well as Poroshenko did. And this is one of the main concerns a lot of people have.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Plenty of things to add. I mean, one thing is, unfortunately, that scenario of Ukraine losing its sovereignty and integrity is still on the table.
On the table.
Right? As we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, what are the conditions that Putin would agree to with regard to Donbass? I mean, would he fully withdraw? Would he not? What would that mean? Would we have elections? I mean, with Minsk, no one ever liked Minsk in Ukraine or elsewhere but Moscow, really.
Yeah, it was a victory for Moscow.
But people said, but we didn't have an alternative, so we have Minsk, so we have to live up to Minsk somehow. And with US also, it was always most often than not, then Ukraine should live up to the expectations under Minsk. But then there were some deviations occasionally when promotion we also heard, maybe if the other side is not doing their part, then maybe you're allowed Ukraine also can, sidestep from your obligations.
The problem with Minsk because there was the sequencing was not clear.
Exactly, yeah.
The sequencing was not clear. Putin effectively wanted Ukraine to their definition of federalism was legitimizing the de facto authorities in the Donbass and in the so-called LNR and DNR, and then we could talk about everything else. And Poroshenko's position was, you give us back control of our border, our internationally recognized border, and then we can talk about everything else. And that sequencing was not clear. If you read the document, that sequencing was not clear, intentionally so.
On getting back Donbass, it's always been like you said. It's all a matter of cost. At what cost and what conditions? I mean, if you look at Ukraine's public opinion, also for years now, people don't want to see Donbass released to Russia or elsewhere, or any other status. They want Donbass back, but they don't want to pay a high price for that. Just last night, 2 Ukrainian military people died. I would like to stress this out, because there is this impression in the West especially that everything's fine there. This war has been forgotten for a number of years now, but especially now when Macron and others are saying, everything's fine, there's been a swap of prisoners, so there is no war, and there is a war. So that's even worse. We had a war, and we had a talk about the war ongoing. Now we still have a war, but no one is even talking about it. But the people are still being killed, so how is that better? I don't see that as an improvement.
No, I mean, in one way, Moscow has been is to use this frozen conflict. It's not really frozen; it's kind of a thawed frozen conflict. People are still
that's a problem.
Dying there. I went up to the occupation line in the Sking Valley region of Georgia.
I did too.
And that is pretty much a frozen. Although the Russians are creating borders and moving fencing and slowly creep. But
again, no one is paying any attention.
No one's paying any attention to it. But the thing about the Donbass, and this is, I'd actually like to get your opinion of this, Volodya, as a Ukrainian who's dealing with these issues. I often thought, and I would never say cede the territory, Or there are those who will. Alexander Motil up at Rutgers will say, cede the territory.
But he is.
But but there is you can make that argument and just like be done with it and get on with reforming the rest of Ukraine. I don't say that. I say, let's leave this thing, as frozen as you can. Accept the status quo for the time being. And I'm not saying I favor this. I'm just kind of throwing this out there. Similar to what you're effectively doing. Never give up your claim to this territory as a part of a sovereign Ukraine. But
So for it to become like another Crimea, basically.
Basically.
No, I disagree.
And you reform the rest of Ukraine and you fight that battle another day. Is that because this to me the advantage, and again I don't know if I favor this, but the advantage to this is you take that leverage away from Russia. We are going to reform the part of Ukraine we have control over, turn it into as big a success story as possible. And when we are, a fully integrated member of the Euro-Atlantic community prospering, then let's talk about Donbass.
Yeah, I don't think that would never stop being leverage for Russia, even under conditions that you describe. And you don't trade away your territory.
I'm not saying give up territory. I'm not saying give up territory.
Well, I don't know.
I don't know what I think about this. I don't like the idea of Russia having this bit of leverage that it can continue to use to destabilize Ukraine and to stop its path to Euro-Atlantic integration. That's what bothers me.
Well, yes, we shouldn't agree to conditions of getting Donbass back from Russian occupation if that would require undermine Ukraine. And Ukrainians are well aware of that. So it's not that we are willing to continue to fight and lose our guys on the front line, but not all conditions are good for us. So we really know that there's a Trojan horse. They want to return Donbass maybe
they want it to return as a Trojan horse.
So
exactly.
And we don't want that. So there's a big game played, and not just by Kyiv, but also when you mentioned that Poroshenko was good in this kind of game on Minsk with our American friends and Western friends. They've been very important partners in this game, I think, and people like Kurt Walker and others, they've been instrumental in with Ukraine working the best out of this difficult Minsk situation.
Don, why don't you put your State Department hat on? What would you be recommending?
I conceptualize it differently, which is to say, at what price do you have a deal? And I was more worried about Zelenskyy before than I am now. I don't think there will be a deal that would be
detrimental to Ukraine's sovereignty.
However, there's too much talk about Minsk and Normandy. These are bad deals which will hurt Ukraine and which Putin is using. Putin has not flinched for a second in 5 years. It's about his strategic goals for Ukraine. The fact that we see this coming up again, and I was glad you mentioned the French, is appalling because they're ignoring a war. The Russian goals have not changed. Russian tactics have adjusted to advance their goals.
Should we tear up Minsk?
I think so, yeah.
Get rid of the Normandy format?
And I don't think Russia at any time soon in our lifetime is going to be a member of the European security architecture. And I wonder what cheap wine the President of France must be drinking. And I want to highlight a particular problem here, which is to say the uncertainty about U.S. support with Bolton's departure. I'm going to put this analytically in the next 2 years. Kiev and Zelenskyy, I think, are going to be under considerable pressure to hold the line. And I think they will, and the U.S., I think, in the end, will support their holding the line. But these concerns were not there even 3 months ago. I think it's a very, very worrisome thing what's going to happen. So Putin, as he always does, opportunistically sees the chance to revive Normandy and the Minsk Accords, which were bad deals. And now we have to talk about this again. Flush them.
Do you worry that if we tear up Minsk, the war starts the war never stopped, but the war starts again?
I do not think...
But Minsk is not working anyway, so...
Yeah, exactly. It's not working anyway.
It's a paper, so...
Despite the fact that some observers always talk about the Russians' ability to turn this back up anytime they want. I don't think so. The totality of pressure on Putin, domestically, financially, boys coming home in body bags, is such that I think he's more or less okay with where they are now, frozen whatever you want to call it, and he can just try to achieve his goals, which he is, in other ways. So I don't think he's going to ratchet up the war. What's he going to do? Attack Kharkiv and then lose Macron.
Right, or attack Mariupol. Is
Yes,
the other
yes,
one
Mariupol
people are
or
really
wherever.
worried about.
Besides, he's already reached his objective of, weakening Ukraine anyway, destabilizing Ukraine, because he has Donbass. He doesn't have a reason to attack anywhere further.
One of the things that was coming up again and again in Georgia is that Putin has learned from his mistakes in Ukraine, and Putin has learned from his mistakes in Georgia, and he's changing tactics. He's certainly changing them in Georgia.
Right.
And he's going towards a much slower kind of boil the frog before the frog knows what's going on.
He's also trying to return to soft power, which was a major weapon in regards to both Georgia and Ukraine now.
So
he traded soft power away for the hard power back in 2014 towards Ukraine, and he kind of lost Ukraine for a few years. And then, like you said, he's learning his mistake, and he's understanding that in the longer run, he needs to apply more of that soft power.
And here the analytical community in the West, I think, Brian, is often behind the curve. They give Putin too much credit for his campaign in Donbass. Volodymyr is absolutely right. He's changing to adjust the situation after miscalculating to begin with. And he's recouping his momentum a little bit, and that's our duty in the West to see that for what's going on and come up with appropriate policy responses. Kurt, yes, great to have him there.
No, Kurt's done God's work there.
Can I say, I don't know how much time we will have on the program today. I want to talk a bit about U.S. with regard to Ukraine. One problem that we're having today, that of course in Ukraine a lot of people think that the U.S. support is fledgling. I'm not sure that's what is happening, but there are some signs of it, and people read those signs maybe mistakenly. A lot of people are confused in Ukraine in terms, of foreign policy of this administration on any dimension, including Ukrainian. And, when the security system's been frozen up or something or blocked for whatever reason, and I think New York Times and Washington Post and both, they had in their recent articles on the subject, these quotes that, they say that Zelenskyy is confused, he's lost, and he's basically saying, what have we done wrong? What have we done to deserve this? Why is this happening? And of course, naturally, people try to come up with also serious and we should be focusing in our bilateral relations on the bigger things, meaningful things, substance.
And
instead,
with all this noise out there in the background,
yes, it's very hurtful.
Ukraine's friends are still here.
Right, I know.
We ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, I met them in this town.
They're in government and they're out of government. They're in Congress.
They're in Congress for sure.
They're in the foreign policy
and
establishment. They're in the State Department.
Yeah, Congress
they're in the
going
think tank.
And the Pentagon.
And the Pentagon. And we
and as you say, though, the
not.
message has been mixed. Absolutely.
Right. We are not going anywhere.
Yeah, that's good.
But I think what you need to have is more synergy between. If Zelensky's confused, send a high-level delegation over here to meet with people in Congress and to meet with
but they're meeting all the time. They've been two senators just a few days ago.
And there's going to be legislation on military assistance, is my understanding. A vote's coming up in the House, right? Last time I checked.
Yeah.
So I think we will start to see some signals now.
And the House is looking. 3 committees of the House are looking into the whole.
Yes.
Pressuring on Ukraine.
Yes, and this is going to spur, I think, the defense assistance that's going to be coming. I understand that people are confused. Ukraine's friends in this town ain't going anywhere.
That's good.
I could send
that. And I can see that when Pentagon took one day for Pentagon to say, it's clear. We see assistance as useful and working. It's viable. It's fine with us. We should continue. So.
Before we wrap up, the last thing I did want to touch on, Volodya, I'd love to get your Zelensky's foreign policy team. Can you assess each of the key players for us?
Right, that's an interesting question. And first of all, let me say that there is a presidential administration, which is now called Office of President, of course. It doesn't matter. And then there is the government.
Right.
And there has always been a problem in Ukraine, frankly, that the presidential administration was interfering too much in the domain of foreign policy at the expense of foreign ministry.
Right.
Would that be the case now? Could be, because Pristak is excellent, a diplomat, very experienced. His heart is in a good place, but he's strong-willed enough to withstand the pressure.
And does he have Zelensky's ear? Is he going to be a strong foreign minister?
Exactly. He's definitely not in the inner circle of Zelenskyy.
Right.
Far from it. And then if he gets some phone calls from presidential administration, you should do that and do that. That would be contrary to his intuition of what he should be doing. How would he behave? That's a big question there.
These are very important points because he was an advisor to the Office of the President, and now he moved over.
Right.
See,
That's a different
it's hard to
position
get a
now.
measure of that relationship, as you said.
And there is this Bogdan guy who is running this presidential administration. Kind of seedy characters,
Right.
We knew that Americans here also didn't like him to be appointed to this position. But then again, we actually seen an example of how American influence on Ukraine has a limit, because
Right.
Zelensky said, no, we're going to have him
Right.
as head of president administration. I need him. He's important, so who's actually running the country. That's not a bigger issue.
Right.
Like we're talking about Zelensky and his policies. Is it his policies or is it policies of someone else
Right.
in his, Grey Cardinals, whatever, inner
Right.
circle? That's a big question there too. And Kolomoisky.
Well,
yeah.
and there were worries that, I don't want Ukraine to revert from oligarchic pluralism to the dominance of one oligarch. I want Ukraine to move from oligarchic pluralism
I would
to
actually,
real pluralism.
but out of two evils, I would actually prefer some balance.
I would prefer oligarchic pluralism,
yes,
exactly,
yes,
to the dominance of a single oligarch. Don, last thoughts before
My last
we wrap
thought was
it
just
up.
I think Ukrainians have to realize that I think they have been not always, I don't blame anybody in particular, as skilled as they might be in dealing with the U.S. or the West. I'm hopeful now with Pristyko and the new president, they will be better at it, because I think they have not been as effective as they might otherwise be. So,
probably
as
true.
you say, Brian, we're all friends here. We want to help, and we reach out, and I know they will too. So I hope we can go from there.
All right. Volodya, last
Right,
thoughts?
thanks. Yeah, and I thank you for your encouraging, message in terms of American support. And I know that there is a lot of support. That's my field. I'm going to be speaking on U.S.-Ukraine relations tomorrow at the Ponders Eurasia conference here in D.C. So that's one thing. But a lot of people in Ukraine are confused, when they're hearing
sure.
these messages.
I hope you're getting over to the Hill.
know,
seeing some people over there.
I've seen some people in the Hill, some people at State, and so on. So I'm getting some
Because
information.
don't
and,
underestimate the
yeah.
value of people like you coming over
Sure.
here and talking to people on the Hill and talking to people in State and in the Pentagon, because that has value.
Right.
That's part of the relationship as well, as much as the relationship between the president of Ukraine
Absolutely.
and the president of the United States.
I never did. So finally, I think there is reasons for cautious optimism on various fronts, domestic and foreign policy. Let's just not jump ahead of ourselves.
Right.
But if he actually, Zelensky and his team follows up, promises are followed up by actual moves in the right direction, that would be a great thing. And Western support is always appreciated. We are still not done with this major conflict that we have with Russia. And that's essential. That's existential to us.
Yeah.
But I would add, as always, but you've come a long way.
Right.
Yes.
It'd be my pleasure to be with you, Don and Brian.
All right. Yeah, no, that's a
My
nice
pleasure, too.
optimistic way to wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio has been veteran Kremlin watcher and former U.S. State Department official Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us in the studio has been Volodymyr Dubovyk, an associate professor in the Faculty of International Relations at Mechnikov National University in Odessa, one of my favorite towns in the world, and director of its Center for International Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for an enlightening
Thank you.
discussion.
Thank you, Brian.
And also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and working throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you could follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week, and now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.